Major funding for this program is provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, by public television stations, by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the Chubb Group of insurance companies, for over 100 years providing worldwide business and personal insurance through independent agents and brokers. Additional funding is provided by the George D. Smith Fund, the Christopher Reynolds Foundation, and other contributors. This program contains scenes of graphic violence. Viewer discretion is advised.
I think Vietnam was probably the greatest single error that America has made in its national history.
Vietnam, I think, has, at least for a period, diverted our attention from the central issue of how the world is to organize itself to prevent World War III.
Vietnam is still with us. It has divided the consensus that carried American foreign policy through a generation. It created the doubts about American judgment, about American credibility, and American power.
But for me, the greatest legacy of the war in Vietnam is that I will never believe my government again.
"30 years after the first American died in Vietnam, the last Americans were leaving, waiting on the U.S. Embassy roof to be flown to safety. The long war was ending in the defeat of the South Vietnamese state that America had supported for 2 decades. What kind of peace finally was at hand? What would be the meaning of peace? To many South Vietnamese, peace meant the end of their way of life. The Americans helped 65,000 to escape in the last weeks of war. Thousands more, families of officials, businessmen, and others with close links to the Americans, fled in terror.
I was 14 years old when I left Saigon in 75. At 6 o'clock we heard on the radio that the soldiers have to give up, so the communists will come in for peace. My father didn't believe that, so he decided to go no matter what. It was like a movie to me because we didn't know what's going on. I was so afraid. The communists stopped us and asked where we would be going, but my father had to bribe them by giving a diamond watch. I saw my father slip his watch to the comrade's hand, so the guy was smiling and he was satisfied, so he let us go.
To the North Vietnamese soldiers who took Saigon, peace meant the end of the anti-colonial war that had started 30 years before.
Thì khi mà chúng tôi vào Liên Dinh Độc Lập, thì tôi lên ngay tầng.
When we arrived at the palace, I walked up to the second floor, where members of the puppet administration had gathered. Luong Van Minh then stepped out of the crowd and said, "I've been waiting for you since early this morning in order to turn over the government to you." To which I replied at once, "There is no need to talk of turning over the government to us. Your entire administration has collapsed. People cannot turn over what they do not have in their own hands. Your only choice is to surrender."
To many Saigonese, peace brought a glimmer of hope.
The South Vietnamese government was really not good for us before, and maybe now is the change. And at least we can see our country now with the full length from north to south, and no more war, no more hostility. Therefore, we came out the street to see what communists look like. And we saw the communist army, they're really nice, and they smile with us. we saw a forest of flags and slogan and the picture of Ho Chi Minh.
Everybody like family, big family now, no more.
The communists use a lot of beautiful words. For example, nothing is precious than freedom and independence. Now we are free and independent, and we can visit Hanoi. Maybe we can know the whole country. Then after that, day by day, we realize a lot of terrible things.
130,000 refugees from Indochina made their way to Guam and on to America by the end of 1975. By 1976, the flow of refugees had slowed and the war had faded into a kind of limbo. America saluted the country's 200th birthday in a joyful outpouring of patriotic celebration. Sailing ships from around the world assembled in the Hudson River to do honor to the nation on the 4th of July. The confusion and discord among Americans that had marked the Vietnam era were nowhere in evidence. But the bicentennial was also a presidential election year. As the major parties positioned themselves, they offered conflicting judgments on the meaning of Vietnam. The Democratic Party's platform plank on Asia stated, "The Vietnam War has taught us the folly of becoming militarily involved where our vital interests were not at stake."
The President of the United States and Mrs. Ford.
Stressing America's vital strategic interests in Asia, the Republican plank blamed the Democratic Congress for refusing adequate military aid to Indochina, thus allowing the Communists to win. During the campaign, the candidates clashed repeatedly over how to deal with the young men who had avoided military service.
I gave, in September of 1974, an opportunity for all draft evaders, all deserters, to come in voluntarily, clear their records by earning an opportunity to restore their good citizenship. I don't think we should go any further.
Governor Carter? I don't advocate amnesty. I advocate pardon. There's a difference, in my opinion, and in accordance with the ruling of the Supreme Court and according to the definition in the dictionary. Amnesty means that what you did was right. Pardon means that what you did, whether it's right or wrong, you're forgiven for it.
More than 200,000 men were accused of draft evasion during the Vietnam era. President Carter gave them a blanket pardon on his first day in office. Among the first to come home from Canada was Anthony Rodriguez.
I see the whole Vietnam issue as a very divisive issue in the country. And maybe this is really the first step towards reconciling some of the different ideas.
Mr. Carter should have waited a bit more than one day to do this, if he was going to do it at all. There are other priorities he should have set to heal the wounds of war, if that's what he really wanted to do. There are 1,300 families or more who don't know where their sons are. I'm talking specifically about them missing in action. Also, there are Vietnam veterans who are unemployed and who did serve this country honorably and who are wounded, who are not receiving their rights and things of this nature. And I feel that the first priority should have been given to these people, to these men, and then maybe we could talk about the others.
Carter himself deeply wanted to have some major symbolic actions of reconciliation. He had pledged during the campaign to the League of MIA Families that he would send a delegation to Hanoi to pursue the search for the accounting of MIA families. In March of '77, he sent this team to Vietnam, headed by Leonard Woodcock and Mike Mansfield. I think it was, at best, a very difficult road to create a reconciliation between the United States and Vietnam after the horrendous, lacerating events of the previous decade.
the course of these meetings, the Vietnamese have informed us that they are giving us the remains of 12 American servicemen. They will be flown out of Vietnam with the commission. We welcome this positive step by the Vietnamese government. We have also established a mechanism for the provision of additional information on our missing men.
The League of MIA Families had a powerful emotional issue which grabbed the souls of many Americans beyond the immediate families.
We want an accounting. We want them to stop dribbling out remains 11 at a time anytime it's politically expedient to suddenly find some to deliver to a congressional delegation. We want them to put some priority on getting the accounting and doing it now.
There were 2,500 of the Americans who died in Vietnam who remained unaccounted for at the end of the war. Now that's 4% of the Americans who died in Vietnam, compared to the 22% of Americans who died in Korea and 22% of the Americans who died in World War II, whose bodies never were recovered. That's a remarkable percentage and a tribute to the determination and skill of the United States military in recovering the bodies of their dead. However, pilots went down in the north, and other people were lost in the south, whose bodies were never recovered.
If the Vietnamese are so anxious to get normalized relations and trade, then let them do what President Carter supposedly has this big human rights thing going on. If they're so concerned about human rights, why don't they get the Vietnamese to cooperate on the humanitarian issue of the accounting?
In April 1977, Vietnamese Premier Pham Van Dong arrived in Paris, where Vietnam and America had agreed to talk about establishing diplomatic relations, separate from the MIA issue. His arrival fired political passions among the refugees. At a press conference, Dong expressed hope for better relations with America.
Voyez-vous, j'ai été et je serai toujours optimiste.
The premier's optimism may have been linked to a letter from an American president.
The Vietnamese took a position in 1977, an idiotic position, in my view, a self-defeating position, which the American public understandably and instantaneously rejected, that the United States had to pay up the money promised to the Vietnamese by Nixon in a letter he had sent them on February 1st, 1973, $4.75 billion of credits and grants. Now, that letter was secret at the time. Nixon has subsequently disavowed it in effect by saying that it was linked to actions of the Vietnamese which never took place. And in any case, there was no possibility that the American public, the Congress, were going to give money to the Vietnamese. It just was not in the cards.
We have always, for the last 25 years, opposed Vietnam's entry into the United Nations. This year, we did not oppose it. And now Vietnam will be a member of the world community in the United Nations. I don't have any apology to make about that action. I am not in favor of the United States paying any money or reparations to Vietnam, however.
America was not in a mood to help an undefeated and unrepentant enemy.
In the fall of 1978, I continued under presidential instructions my talks in New York with Nguyen Co Thach. We met several times, and in the second of our meetings here in New York, Thach dropped the demand the Vietnamese had maintained for the previous 3 years that the United States pay war reparations or aid to Vietnam as the price of recognition. When he dropped that demand, he thought that the way was now clear for immediate progress. But the boat people were pouring out into Southeast Asian waters, into the South China Sea, and there was a worldwide uproar. And on November 2nd, while we were in the process of reviewing what we should do, the Vietnamese and the Russians signed a treaty of peace and friendship with considerable ceremony in Moscow between Brezhnev and Pham Van Dai. This series of events made us decide that we ought to go slow.
The United States of America and the People's Republic of China have agreed to recognize each other and to establish diplomatic relations as of January the 1st, 1979. The normalization of relations between the United States and China has no other purpose than this: the advancement of peace.
We, when we went into office, very deliberately sat down and defined for ourselves about 10 objectives for the 4 years. And I remember quite vividly that the 5th objective was that we would normalize relations with China during the first term, and we even set for ourselves the objective of normalizing relations by 1979. When we began to cope with the American-Chinese relationship, which required a great deal of domestic effort, we were conscious of the fact that China and Vietnam were at loggerheads. They were in a condition of severe hostility with some limited fighting. Not of the kind of fighting that developed later in February, March of 1979, but still, in effect, shooting. And thus, it was out of the question to try to normalize relations with both at the same time. It would also diminish the importance of the new American-Chinese relationship. And therefore, I made certain that we moved in a deliberate fashion, purposeful fashion, in normalizing relations with China, but that we would put aside, while doing that, any improvement of relations with Vietnam.
Viewed from Hanoi, America's reversal seemed ironic. America had gone to war in Vietnam to contain Chinese communist expansion. Now, to please China, it was refusing to make peace with Vietnam. Vietnam needed all the aid it could get. The war may have cost as many as 2 million Vietnamese dead and 4.5 million wounded north and south, 1/10 of the country's entire population. Vast areas had been battlefields, devastated by 3 times the total tonnage of bombs dropped in all of World War II. The Vietnamese peasantry had endured 30 years of increasingly sophisticated warfare supplied by the big powers on both sides. While pursuing their aim of national reunification, the Hanoi leadership had built a Soviet-style state in North Vietnam.
For tonight's news, please join us in watching the National Conference of Veterans and War Heroes Families, the development of production, and the program of Little Flowers.
Peace did not mean prosperity. As in wartime, workers were required to devote their days off from regular jobs to tasks of reconstruction. But they were tired of making sacrifices and longed for the fruits of peace.
Since the end of the war, without all those bombs dropping down on us, we have lost much of our former fervor. We now complain of housing shortages and food shortages. But during the war years, you never heard anyone complaining about anything at all.
Peace had brought a new name to Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City. It was plagued by uncounted numbers of prostitutes and drug addicts, 2 million refugees from the countryside, and 700,000 unemployed. Tough northern officials, determined to build a communist society, took over from their former Viet Cong comrades. Southerners quickly lost their illusions.
Some months later, we soon realized that really the Communist Party, they try to make the people become robots to serve for any interest of the Communist Party.
When the communists took over South Vietnam, I didn't go to teach anymore because I can see that they had a lot of discrimination policy. So I stay home and try to plan with my family to escape because the situation in South Vietnam is worse and worse.
The bloodbath predicted by many, mass executions of political opponents, did not take place in Vietnam. But 1.5 million Southerners were forced to resettle in new economic zones. The zones were remote, and the land was often poor. Many found the work too hard and the distractions too few. Some drifted back into Saigon, increasing the numbers of those who felt they had no future in Vietnam. The new government oppressed the Chinese business community for both racial and economic reasons, and they interned more than 200,000 political suspects in so-called re-education camps in the first 12 months of peace.
Right after April 1975, I was called and reported to the communist post, and they sent me to the re-education camp.
Like all the camp, they have 10 lessons. That means, they introduce themselves, what is the communist doing for our country, and who is the U.S.
And the last lesson, I think, was communist Russia is a great country. It's our, heaven.
So first, we trust them, and we thought that, maybe, after, a few lessons, we can come back, to our family and live with a normal life, right? So all of us, we try to study and try to trust them.
The physical condition is survive day by day, and many people was killed and by, disease, because the condition is, was no way you can describe here, because the people that starving.
One time I start to catch one frog for eating, and one of the police, communist police, he saw that, and they pushed me into a very small room, and they make something like a locker by one piece of wood with a 5 holes, 1 horn for the neck, 2 horns for hands, and 2 horns for feet. And they push all of my body in there, and they lock it up, and they left me like that for 1 week. After that, right, for 2 days, I couldn't stand up, right, because all of my body, just like a roll, something like that for 1 week.
At the moment that I escaped from the re-education camp, I made my mind that I have to escape from the country, all price. But to manage to do that is the matter of money and the chance.
Life in post-war Vietnam was grim. It was worse in neighboring Cambodia. Thousands of Cambodian refugees were escaping with stories of almost unbelievable horrors. In Cambodia, peace meant death.
Now I talk about the killing in my hometown is they kill all the soldiers, even your private soldier, the teachers, and all the educated people, nurses, all everybody, even their own people, their own cadre, the comrade, when they think they are not good, they arrest them. Nobody knows what's going on. They just arrest and beat them along the road and disappear.
The Cambodian communists, the Khmer Rouge, had seized power in a shattered society in 1975. Led by Pol Pot, they drove the population into vast agricultural collectives. Cambodia drew closer to China and increasingly hostile to Vietnam. Fearing communist China, communist Vietnam invaded communist Cambodia. Nationalism was stronger than ideology. The Vietnamese intervened to unseat Pol Pot. They also put an end to the Holocaust.
My first trip inside Cambodia occurred while I was working on Cambodian refugee and famine relief programs. I made a second trip to Cambodia to photograph the evidence that remained of what had happened under the Khmer Rouge.
At the Chung Ek mass gravesite, victims' skulls were still blindfolded and their arms still bound. Later, the remains were collected in memorial sheds where Buddhist ceremonies were held. At Tonle Batif, a former school served as the execution center. Another district-level execution center was established at Tom On.
There was essentially a three-tiered structure of murder by government in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge. At the top of the pyramid, so to speak, was a prison execution extermination system where people who were presumed to be opponents, enemies of the regime, traitors to the revolution, were individually executed. Places like Tuol Sleng, 15,000 people were individually executed, and only 7 survived from that. It was a former school, and a hallway was knocked between the individual rooms, and small cinder block cells were constructed where prisoners were held, bound by leg irons that were cemented into the floor. When the Vietnamese invaded, they did so quickly that essentially the Khmer Rouge jailers and prison officials ran off, fled for their lives, and left behind scores of thousands of pages of documentation that had been utilized at this prison execution center. And it's very surprising that you would have in an illiterate peasant country a bureaucracy of death that was that efficient and that developed literally an Asian Auschwitz, as it were. And you have photographs of individuals taken after they were dead or nearly dead that could also be sent on to party higher-ups to show that these traitors to the revolution had been killed and they were not being harbored. As the revolution failed to work, they kept looking about for who was sabotaging it now, because they had figured that they had eliminated the enemies to the revolution, but still things weren't working, so they sought scapegoats. You have essentially, in 3.5 years of Khmer Rouge rule, somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 million out of 7 million people dying through a combination of execution, induced starvation, exhaustion, and disease.
Five weeks after the defeat of the Khmer Rouge, China sent an army of 200,000 across the border to punish Vietnam for its invasion of Cambodia. Once again, Vietnamese civilians fled from gunfire. Once again, peace meant war in Southeast Asia. The Chinese withdrew in 4 weeks but continued to harass Vietnam, while Vietnam strove to consolidate its domination of Cambodia. The flow of refugees became a torrent as the tension increased. Vietnamese and ethnic Chinese risked their lives in escaping from Vietnam. Thousands died. All suffered hardships. Pirates operating off the coast of Thailand preyed mercilessly on the boat people.
We come from Vietnam.
How many days?
15 days.
15 days?
Yeah.
How many people?
19.
19 people?
Two children, two baby, and two women, and two baby. He start to die, but we try to make some price. How about the pirates? No pirates?
Pirates.
Pirates, yeah. We can... Can I tell the truth?
Yes.
Yeah. Everybody here, everything is off. Out.
What happened?
Take off.
They took it?
Yeah.
How many times did they attack you?
Actually, 1 day and a half.
Did you eat? Yesterday? Today?
9 days. 9 days. 9 days. Today, this man give me some food.
He gave you some food?
Yeah, and we come here.
And before that, you don't have food?
No, nothing.
No food for 9 days?
Yeah, no, 9 days.
No water?
No water. No food.
No food.
Nearly 2 million Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians fled Indochina from 1975 through 1983. 200,000 remain in Southeast Asian refugee camps because no country will accept them. Nguyen Mui and his family were among the fortunate ones.
We left Vietnam on the 21st January at 2 o'clock in the morning. When we are away from the coast, the ocean, they have not windy wind. But when we are about 20 kilometers from the coast, the wind is very high. And there is the big storm, a little bit big storm. All the children have seasick. We are very worried. Around us all night, all one color, the dark, the black. We planned this escape for a year. We know that it is very dangerous, but we have no choice. There's only one choice, the choice between the freedom or the death. I got the news sometime in August that my family was accepted to go to the States. We were very happy because I think that I can manage to be there to give my children opportunity to grow.
Glad to meet you. I'm Ken Homer.
By the end of 1983, nearly 700,000 Indo-Chinese, mainly from Vietnam, had reached America. No other country had accepted so many. As they rebuild their lives in America, most look back in longing to their homeland.
It's my hope that the regime in my country will change. That means that my country is not communist anymore. It is in my heart that I hope that day will happen so that I can return to my country. Because our people, the Asiatic in general or in the Vietnamese in particular, we were very tied to where we were born.
I want to remain forever in Lang Son. After me, my children. And after my children, my grandchildren.
Like the refugees, people in Vietnam also express strong attachment to their native land.
No matter how many times the foreign invaders come and destroy this place, I will continue to rebuild and will continue to remain here forever. I'm not afraid. If I have to fight again, I will fight again. This is my native land. I love it here and will never leave it. So that's what I think.
My hope is to build a socialist system in my country, to bring happiness to the people, and most importantly, to keep our country unified. 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 Not only in my lifetime does my country have to be kept unified, but also in the lives of my children, my grandchildren, and their children after them. We will never allow any country, no matter how powerful, to encroach upon our country.
I feel that I can never leave the Vietnamese people. I feel that I must help them in every way that I can. This is because my whole life and that which is most beautiful of my ideal are so closely connected with Vietnam. I can never leave her.
All of us wanted to contribute to the development of our nation. Looking back, we can certainly see that there have been lost opportunities. If the French government and the various American administrations had been more reasonable, more understanding, and more intelligent, then the war could have been avoided. And consequently, damages to the United States and to France could also have been avoided. We never wanted to have a war.
Vietnam can be viewed in retrospect as the last and longest of the post-World War II colonial conflicts. It can be viewed as a civil war. It can also be viewed as an episode of the Cold War, like Korea in the early 1950s. But whatever the view, it was a tragic war for the peoples of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Peace has left them poverty-stricken, oppressed, and almost entirely dependent on the Soviet Union. And communist Vietnam is still America's enemy. The war that was never declared has never ended. For many Americans, Vietnam, the country, a real place inhabited by real people, has become Vietnam, the lesson.
What we should have learned from Vietnam, the exact opposite of what has happened to us. No more Vietnams. That accounts for Angola, Ethiopia, Yemen, Afghanistan, Iran today, name it.
Until we know the enemy, know our allies, know our friends, and then know ourselves, we better keep out of this dirty business. It's very dangerous.
The only reason to go to war at any time is to overthrow a government that's doing something you don't like. And if you announce at the outset that you're not going to overthrow the government, then so far as I'm concerned, you should come home immediately.
Basically, we should ask once, twice, 10 times before we arrogate to ourselves the right to kill anybody in a foreign country in order to determine the government of that country as we see fit.
And I think a lesson to be learned is that young men should not be sent to the battlefield unless the country is going to support them.
The young men sent to the battlefields of Vietnam mainly went alone and returned alone, often to indifference, hostility, or silence.
You know, you begin to see a lot of instant insanity and brutality that I don't think anybody prepared you for. And then one day, all of a sudden, you're back on this airplane with stewardesses and people who are laughing and happy, and you're coming out of this freaky atmosphere, and you land back in the United States of America, and nobody cares. Nobody wants you to be in uniform. You get in a taxi, and off you go. You try and go home.
The animosity was, even on the airplane flying out here, the animosity was there. People would shun you. The people would try to stay away from you. Not many people would even talk to you.
We were not very well prepared to come home. When we came home, we found out there was a taboo. The taboo is you don't talk about having been in combat service or in Vietnam, and we won't ask you about it. It was a comfortable contract.
In the period right after Vietnam, we found that we had an army which was searching for a mission in conjunction with its role as part of all the forces of our national defense. We had an army in which we had lost the basic unison and cohesion that exists within organizations. We had lost our non-commissioned officer corps. There were questions being raised at that time as to why an army.
After Vietnam, a reduced role for American forces was part of the Nixon Doctrine, which relied on heavily armed, dependent states to be extensions of American power abroad. Iran was a major example until Islamic revolutionaries overthrew the Shah's regime in early 1979. The strategic setback in Iran was compounded by a growing sense of national frustration in America.
The U.S. Embassy in Tehran has been invaded and occupied by Iranian students. The Americans inside have been taken prisoner, and according to a student spokesman, will be held as hostages until the deposed Shah is returned from the United States, where he's receiving medical treatment for cancer.
We have enough people to fight with the American, and if they fight with us, they will lose it, like they lost in Vietnam.
This was the start of a 444-day ordeal. 5.5 months after the hostages were taken, a military operation to free them failed. The continuing spectacle of American impotence may have cost President Carter his re-election. On his last day in office, the hostages were freed. Their homecoming celebrations stirred painful memories in some Vietnam veterans.
First of all, I want to make it very clear that we're happy that the hostages have come home. But we want the American people to know that Vietnam veterans had a very difficult and different homecoming than the hostages did.
They come back and they're heroes to the people. Yet what did they really do? They spent a year in captivity. A lot of guys here spent a year in Vietnam, went through a lot more.
Hey, what about us?
The humiliation in Iran brought public demands that America reassert its power. It also brought heightened public awareness of the human legacy of Vietnam. Of 2.5 million who served in Southeast Asia, a substantial number, some estimate 750,000, are still haunted by the experience.
There are a lot of people who were burned during the war years and feel like they can't trust the government, they can't trust the major institutions of the society, and so have retreated into a kind of cynicism or a kind of mistrust of the major institutions and feel like, it's not worth it. Why me? Why bother?
Lots of times I get mad and I want the easy solution. In Vietnam, I learned that if you killed someone, they could never bother you again. And a lot of times over here, I'll get upset about stuff and I'll feel like going out and killing somebody. But now my intellect is in charge instead of my emotions. I know that if I do, I'm going to go to jail. So I'm really going to lose.
I have a lot of stressed thoughts about it's not over yet. I was still, like they say, is it a dream or is it Memorex or what? But I still, in my sleep, see these things going on every night. I'm still a little shaky over it. I haven't begun to settle down yet. And it's a bad thing that happened.
And you wonder why, so many disabled vets have a hard time, because nobody's treating, what's bothering them. They're over their wounds. I mean, you get over your wounds fast. I was healthy 3 months after I'd been shot, but emotionally it took me 8 years.
We were raised with the concept of heroics and the John Wayne movies and all that, and I was raised with that. And I was looking at Vietnam that I would never get hurt, that I would never be injured, that I was doing my duty. I was going there and I was going to kill the commies and I was going to come home.
David Christian was the youngest lieutenant, then the youngest captain, and finally one of the most decorated soldiers in Vietnam. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 2 Bronze Stars, 7 Purple Hearts, and many other awards, all before he was 21 years old.
Coming back to America, coming back to the world, we also, after years of suffering and frustration, trying to find jobs and do other different things, and having the American politicians turn their backs on these boys, come to find out that we were sprayed with this herbicide called Agent Orange, a poison, a dioxin poison.
I was sitting in the hospital. I'd been in the hospital 6 months since last October, fighting every day for my life. And I was just reading the Daily News, and on May 17th, there was a small article in there warning Vietnam veterans of possible cancer or genetic defects due to Agent Orange that was sprayed over in Vietnam. And that just put 2 and 2 together. I was a crew chief over there, and we flew missions in the same areas at the same time that they were defoliating. Being with the 20th Engineer Group over there, the engineers also defoliated areas around all the perimeters, and I was close to it all the time. No one ever told us that you were dealing with something deadly. I died in Vietnam and didn't even know it.
Before his death of cancer at 28, Paul Reutershand succeeded in drawing public attention to veterans who were suffering from illnesses that they believed were caused by exposure to Agent Orange. The military stopped the use of Agent Orange in 1970. In 1979, the Veterans Administration released a film that tried to address veterans' fears.
Herbicide or dioxin exposure might cause psychological changes, birth defects, or even cancer. But it is important to remember that right now there is still no definite scientific proof.
Several thousand veterans are suing the manufacturers, who assert that no medical studies have proven that exposure to Agent Orange is harmful to humans. Many veterans are unconvinced.
I think the even more tragic story will come out when we've gotten past our wounded pride and our haughtiness and reestablished relations with the people of Indochina and begin to discover what the after effects have been the use of poisons like Agent Orange and other agents there in that country as an indiscriminate part of the war policy.
From 1962 until 1970, the airplane sprayed several times a day. For a period close to a decade, the Vietnamese population below was exposed to the chemical without knowing anything of its impact. It was not until 1970 that they were told of the toxicity of the agent.
The important thing is to integrate our knowledge about what happened in the United States, as say at Times Beach, with what we believe or know happened in Vietnam, and then do careful research to find out.
8 years after the end of the war, the Veterans Administration was still awaiting further medical evidence before compensating Agent Orange health claims. For many veterans, peace has meant awaiting the outcome of epidemiological studies that will take years to complete, and Agent Orange has become a symbol of deceit and betrayal. In 1981, newly elected President Reagan sounded a fresh note of certainty about America's role in the world.
Our forbearance should never be misunderstood. Our reluctance for conflict should not be misjudged as a failure of will. When action is required to preserve our national security, we will act. We will maintain sufficient strength to prevail if need be, knowing that if we do so, we have the best chance of never having to use that strength.
The Reagan administration saw Soviet-inspired threats to the nation's security in Central America and stepped up support to friendly governments in the region. In the ensuing debate, the Vietnam analogy was asserted and denied again and again.
To tell us that this will not lead us into a mass intervention like it did in Vietnam is to simply repeat the naivete with which we bought the idea that advisors would not get us into trouble in Vietnam.
Let me say to those who invoke the memory of Vietnam, there is no thought of sending American combat troops to Central America. They are not needed. Thank you, and as I say, they are not needed, and indeed, they have not been requested there. All our neighbors ask of us is assistance in training and arms to protect themselves while they build a better, freer life.
To begin with, we believe the administration fundamentally misunderstands the causes of conflict in Central America. We cannot afford to found so important a policy on ignorance. And the painful truth is that many of our highest officials seem to know as little about Central America in 1983 as we knew about Indochina in 1963.
Thank you, Mr. President. Why not say categorically that Central America will not be another Vietnam, and that under no circumstances will you impose U.S. troops in a combat situation in Central America?
Well, I said the last time we gathered that there are some things I can make every assurance in the world that we have no such plans, we have no desire, nor do the countries down there want us involved in that way. But I used an expression that has been used by presidents like Franklin Delano Roosevelt and others, and that is that a president should never say never.
One thing that has changed dramatically since Vietnam has been that Congress has passed a War Powers Act. And that places the onus upon the president, if he decides to commit American forces anywhere in the world, to have support of Congress, hence the American people, within 90 days, or he can be required to withdraw those forces.
I don't think we will ever again witness the day when the Congress of the United States is prepared, as it in effect was prior to the Vietnam War, to give the president carte blanche when it comes to the running of American foreign policy.
An American advisor in Honduras had his own Vietnam legacy to pass on to Salvadoran trainees.
Los guerrilleros están usando este método en América Central. Es lo mismo que los guerrilleros estaban usando en Vietnam.
Among the war's legacies has been concern that America might take actions with unforeseen consequences in countries like Vietnam, whose realities were unknown or misunderstood. There has also been concern that America might abstain from actions it should take out of fear of another Vietnam. But American troops have again been sent abroad, to Lebanon and elsewhere, and their leaders have described them as greatly improved.
The people that we have today are very high-class young men and women. Starting with our officer corps, we've been able to attract high-quality young men and women into ROTC. We now are able to bring into the Army almost all high school graduates. One reason is the economy. Other reasons are that it's not out of favor today to be in the military. And of course, the President's support for the military has been one of the major factors as well.
The generation now reaching military age was not born when the Marines first landed in Vietnam. Their father's view of the world was shaped in part by World War II. Recalling Munich and how Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the rest of Europe fell like dominoes before the Nazis, they led America into Vietnam. The youth of the 1960s are the Vietnam generation. Whether they fought the war or fought against it, they can never forget it, and each must now seek its meaning.
I mean, as I look back on the war and I try and characterize it, one of the things that stands out is it was a situation where a very small number of people had to bear all the prices and nobody else had to do anything but watch it on television.
But people that just try to evade things for no reason whatsoever except for their own benefit lose something in that.
The war was not fought by the people who were opposed to the war or by their peers in large part. There was economic injustice is so endemic in the society that it's reflected directly in who ends up in the military, and particularly who ends up dying in time of war.
So I was honored to go, and the involvement, whether it was right or wrong, I really don't have any real feelings about it. I just wanted to serve my country, and where the Marine Corps told me to go, I went and tried to do my best and come home safe to my family, my friends, and to the community in South Boston.
But the perception that hurts the Vietnam veteran more than anything else in America is that we lost the war. We being the soldiers. We never lost one major conflict in Southeast Asia, including Tet. We kicked their butts. We would have kicked their butts onto Moscow if the politicians would have let us.
I was part of the first delegation of Vietnam veterans to go back to Vietnam. To go back to a place where you have fought a war, believe me, is a profound experience. I like to think about Vietnam as being frozen in time, if you wish, in the minds of so many of the men and women that served there during the war. When our people think about Vietnam, they think about it in terms of a country at war, with explosions, with killing, with pain, with suffering, with just an awful lot of anguish. To go back and replace, if you wish, those images with a new look at Vietnam, to see Vietnam as the country, to smell it, to see the rice paddies and the tree lines and the hooches and the people. I think what I came out of this trip to Vietnam with was an understanding. The most significant thing, I believe, that we could do is make a peace with Vietnam, end the war.
The Vietnam generation took a major step toward national reconciliation when the Veterans Memorial was dedicated in November 1982. Sadness, pain, and bitterness were openly expressed. So were strength and compassion.
the war memorial to the Vietnam veterans was conceived and brought into being by a small group of veterans whose dedication to serve was just as strong as ever, but what they were serving was the cause of healing.
I touch the name. It may sound trite to many people, but the people that I know that died, it meant something to me that memorial will be here long after I'm gone. That memorial brings with it a great degree of reverence.
What happened in the course of that week in Washington, D.C. was extraordinary. The renewed sense of a brotherhood just rekindled, if you wish, the understanding and the awareness and the need to carry on in our work in getting us together, and that with that understanding, hopefully, prevent another Vietnam or anything like it from happening again.
The chief legacy of the Vietnam War is an open question, and it's in our country's hands right now. And it is primarily in the hands of the men and women who came of age during the Vietnam War years. It's an open question.
America's Vietnam War is over, but it lives on in all those who experienced it. This and all future generations will have to turn to this long, dark, and hard chapter of history to define the meaning and determine the lessons of Vietnam.
This program was produced by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content. Major funding for this program was provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, by public television stations, by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the Chubb Group of Insurance Companies, for over 100 years providing worldwide business and personal insurance through independent agents and brokers. Additional funding was provided by the George D. Smith Fund, the Christopher Reynolds Foundation, and other contributors. For a transcript of this program, send $4 to Vietnam, Box 322, Boston, Massachusetts, 02134. TV series chief correspondent Stanley Carno has written the companion book Vietnam, A History, published by the Viking Press and available in bookstores and libraries.
Tiger cage. And American POWs were held captive in cages like this one for months, sometimes for years. Some say there were no heroes in Vietnam. I'm Robert Stack, and I invite you to judge for yourself. The Vietnam Experience in Time Life Books brings the war home like nothing else I've ever seen. You'll witness frontline combat so close you can taste it. You'll meet the tunnel rats and SEALs, the Green Beret and medics. The leaders who mapped out the strategies, and the grunts fought to the death carrying them out. Your first book, Combat Photographer, shows you the wars you've never seen it before, with more than 220 photographs, many never before published in civilian eyes. And right now, there's a special reason to call for a 10-day free examination of Combat Photographer. The price of your introductory volume is just $4.99. That's a savings of $10 off the regular series price. And you'll receive this detailed